It's really a privilege and a pleasure to have you on the podcast today. I was excited to share a conversation with you earlier about a few weeks ago, a month now,
Yes,
on your podcast. And we ran out of time.
we did.
To keep talking about some of the things that were hot topics. And so coming on today and pulling on some of those threads, I'm really grateful and happy to have you here.
Really glad for the opportunity. Michelle, of course, always when I'm in your presence, I feel like we just riff off each other's energy. So I'm looking forward to the conversation today.
Well, it's great. We were just talking before we went on air about how our personal lives evolve as we age. And we were talking about almost you have to kind of get to know people in your life and you have to evolve. You know, you either grow with people or you grow away.
It's true.
And that takes effort in these evolutions. And I really feel, Cristi, that we are in a very unique, so we are in this middle-aged world, whatever. I'm not giving numbers, Cristi.
No numbers today.
No
You see this
specifics.
color in the hair, no numbers today, okay?
In this middle-aged world where we have this we have all of this plethora of information and expertise that we have behind us, but then we also have this precious moment to like reshift and shape who we are for the second half of our lives. And I feel like education is almost in this middle-aged space.
It's true.
It has all of this baggage. It's got its great adventures and wonderful, happy success stories behind it. But now it's at that precipice of who you gonna be for the next this next half of your life here, right?
Who are you going to be and how are you going to connect and what are you going to do to serve those around you? Like, I think it's a major piece that higher education is really having a little bit of an identity crisis, like really trying to redefine the value proposition of like, why do we do what we do? Who are we doing it for? And how are we doing it? I totally agree with you on that.
Yeah, I mean, in a personal context, it's that idea of like you're with a partner for a long time. You have to relearn, is this the value proposition of being in this relationship? Does it still stand?
It's true.
Or are we evolving that value proposition? How do you feel? I know you have experience working in all levels of education, and we're going to get into some of the specifics of your experience as we chat here today. But how do you feel this identity crisis is being handled? Have you seen it being handled well? Have you seen it causing great levels of anxiety? I know we've talked already about how some of these conversations we're having with people specifically in higher education around artificial intelligence are causing a lot of trepidation, a lot of fear, a lot of hesitation. Have you seen any examples in your travels and work with Desire to Learn D2L where you see people adapting and evolving to this new reality well?
So yes, I do. And it's been interesting. So when you talk about this, chasm that we're finding between who we used to be and how do we get to who we want to be, really working with institutions, I believe that artificial intelligence since the internet is the disruptor that is going to require us in higher education to shift. I believe that for many decades, we've had this rhetoric and we've known we need to move to maybe a skills-focused approach, or we need to really be thinking about the ways in which, our students can communicate the value of their degrees. But I think that pedagogically, when we think about teaching and learning, like AI is rocking the boat in ways that some institutions and faculty are not really ready to consider. But people who are doing it well are really having engaged conversations, creating task force on their campuses, thinking about guidelines, how we want to engage as an institution. I remember talking with one of the authors of the New York Times article that came out last March when AI was just on the precipice of becoming big, talking with him around equity and inclusion and how they're thinking in his campus about how they're going to do this. And so one of the things he said to me is, we've just decided as a campus, we're going to pay for a paid version of ChatGPT for all students, right? Like we're going to reduce the barrier there, at least as a starting point, because we want our students to know we are committed to this work. And I think that I have so much to say about all of this, but I think that as we've learned more about how this shift is going to take place and how it's going to impact the world of work, like we got to get our head in the game and be ready to prepare our students.
Absolutely. And in the world, I feel like in the world we're faced with, the discrepancies between people. It seems like the gaps are pretty wide. Like there are people who are like like the person you just were referencing at that institution. We're just going to pay for it. We're going to make that commitment. And I feel in the work I do, I feel that it's hard to get that unified voice.
Yeah.
That kind of consensus building, right? If we go back to democracy and this idea of consensus building, that takes time.
It does.
Do you feel like there is room here in these new realities where we need leadership to look, because you have an extensive experience in educational leadership, and it seems as though that gentleman on his campus, there's someone who stood up and said, this is the reality.
Yeah.
Get on board, or, find yourself a new place to work. This is the way that we're going to approach it as an institution. We're going to draft some policies. We're going to pay access for equity, inclusion reasons, and so on. How do you think educational leadership in a lot of these publicly funded institutions that are rooted in this kind of very bureaucratic, very political consensus building schema?
Yeah.
What suggestions do you have for them? Or do you think that they're the old dinosaurs and that's not how leadership's going to look anymore?
Yeah, so I think it's a both and in terms of I find that we have these camps that are like pro AI, pro moving forward in terms of change management, and these camps that are really entrenched in what are the ethical considerations, what are the bias, what are we doing to do some due diligence. I think for educational leaders, it's around this nexus point of really moving forward. Yes, understanding that we want people to get on board. But one, AI isn't going to be a silver bullet, as nothing has been in higher education. We still need to teach people good critical thinking, problem solving, moral courage, teach people to learn and have intellectual curiosity. Those things are never going to shift. And I believe if we do a better job of doing those kinds of competencies, it will be a lot easier for us to redefine this paradigm. But I think it's a both and, in that we have to think about moving forward, but we have to think about mitigating risk at the same time, right? So it's these two parallel tracks. Like, we just don't throw the baby out with the bathwater and say AI is the answer to everything. But at the same time, we have to figure out, like, how do we bring some of those naysayers and curmudgeons along? How can they help us to inform the ways in which we're thinking about mitigating these risk and bias? I was working and talking with a couple students. I did the AI times education conference that was hosted and moderated completely by students. And one of the things the student brought up, she said, I asked Midjourney to give me a picture of a higher education professor. She puts up a screen and there are multiple images on the screen. As you can imagine, they're all male, they're all white, they're all middle-aged. So again, I think it's the start of a conversation. I don't think that it is a place in which we have to choose one camp or the other. I think it's how do we bring people forward in a way that is humanizing, thinking about mitigating these risks, but really we have to get on board. Students are asking us to help them get in the game in this conversation, because when they get to the workforce, and there's a differentiator between someone who has experience utilizing AI and someone who doesn't, that individual who has that experience will get the job.
Absolutely. And you're talking about a variety of levels of identity crises right now, which I'm just going to pull on. I knew this was going to happen, Cristi. I have like a list. I have like a very good list of questions for you. I was going to work our way up. We were, best of intentions, but this is how we roll. This identity crisis that is facing higher education. We're talking about it. We started talking about it as this kind of cultural shift that I think technology has been pushing for a while now.
A long time, yeah.
But now, since COVID and that experience of hyper emergency remote learning, all the gaps and cracks that were exposed in that experience, then the generative GPT coming out, it's now, it's fueled at a speed and kind of going off in so many different directions. So we've talked about this leadership identity crisis. I want to pull on the skills identity crisis, because when you think, this is not that long ago, this is like 1 or 2 generations ago, what education was for was to take knowledge that was in experts' heads and put it in our heads.
That's right.
And there are many people who still believe that that is what education is. Okay.
And they're misinformed.
and it's never that.
Right.
It's not, first of all, you can't put any information in someone's heads, obviously. But there is something to be said about the fact that knowledge, encountering knowledge, and being presented with artifacts in a variety of formats is a way to start to think about concepts and ideas that, great, that does have value. Obviously, we're not throwing the baby in the bathwater out.
Right.
But this idea of skills, what you're talking about, and we resonate on this so hard.
We do.
Like human skills. You know how much I love your term moral courage.
I know you do.
Just define that for people, because when we were talking about last time, define moral courage.
Yes. So I think moral courage for me is the term that I use when you are the only person or the lone voice in the room that's going to raise your hand and say, this is the right thing to do. We have to do this because of students. Here is the data to support it. Like there are spaces where we know where storming and norming in groups happen, right? Like I'm a psychologist by training. So when you think about the ways in which individuals come together and behaviorism happens, it's not often that you are willing to raise your hand and say, we have to do this. And this is why. Here is the reason I'm becoming the disruptor in the room around this conversation. So I use the term moral courage. I've been using it since about 2015 because I think it's really the essence of not just having the ability and the courage to speak up, but the moral obligation we have in the seats that we're holding. Because the reality is when we talk about diversity, equity, inclusion, and really having all voices at the table, sometimes it means we need to scoot over so we can pull up another chair. And to do that, we have to raise our hand. We have to be able to confront some of the issues in the room that no one really wants to talk about.
And counter that neurobiological imperative, which is to belong and to not stand out because they're a risk to our survival. I love it. Yeah. So you talk about skills. A lot of my work revolves around how the world of education used to focus on humans, making humans more human, and developing our innately human capacities, like you named moral courage, critical thinking, problem solving, things of that nature. It has landed me in a camp called innovation, because they tend to be skills that are associated with creativity and agility. Now, but what you've just described is the fact that as institutions, so it's like twofold, this skill identity crisis is happening in two ways.
Yes.
One, we're supposed to be giving students more of these skills.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay. Right? So faculty members or instructors in general are kind of going crazy because they're like, I'm a subject matter expert.
That's right.
I don't even know how to talk about perspective taking or moral courage.
Yes,
I don't find myself to be quite morally courageous.
That's right.
How am I going to be responsible for teaching this in my classroom?
Yeah.
A. B, at the other layer, institutions themselves as organisms have been rooted so often. And you can look at a public school, elementary, secondary, or higher education. They are often static, not dynamic. They're not agile. They're not quick to move. A lot of this consensus building we're talking about before. There requires a set of innovation, this idea of agility, critical thinking, problem solving. Because one of the main, and that is causing the identity crisis in leadership.
It is.
Because they're like, how do we get a decision made? For example, in the public institutions in Ontario or across Canada, you have like Senate policies, procedures.
Right.
So you have to get approval
for
certain policies and procedures at the Senate level, which can take, Cristi.
I know. Years.
Yeah. So this identity crisis, one of the solutions we're proposing, but it's hard to find a pathway because this pathway hasn't been grooved anywhere in the institution. It's hard to find the pathway into faculty members. The one I've found with faculty members and skills is, guess what? You're already doing a lot of these skills.
You're doing a lot of this work.
You're already doing it.
Yeah.
Good pathway in for faculty members in these skill sets that we're talking about. But at the institutional level, there are this idea of putting out a policy on AI, for example.
Yes, policy and guidelines is a huge piece.
And there is a Waterloo University, I'm just going to name them because they've come up with something and they've straight up said, this is iterative. This is not gospel.
Good for them.
Take it for what it is now. But
today.
Exactly. But that's courageous. That is the way of saying, listen, we don't have all the answers. We can't possibly have all the answers, but we want to engage in the space and we want to offer our stakeholders some level of direction. But are you seeing that? So where do you see the skills conversation going in these two levels of identity crisis? Do you see institutions kind of embracing these skill sets in leadership now? Agility. Listen, we're not going to be perfect, but we do have to do this work. And for faculty members, are you seeing, because I know your platform, and we'll get into specific D2L magic in a minute, but there's a lot of benefits to that platform and Brightspace and the work that's happening at D2L to promote a lot of skills-based learning, competence education. Are you finding that road into faculty members as well is something that they're willing to explore these new skills.
So I think there, for decades we've been having conversations around the skills forward approach. However, it's been a lot more rhetoric than it has been action. And so what I am finding is, yes, in pockets, in leadership and in faculty, there are conversations that are now happening. I think coupled with the advent of LLMs, we are now seeing that, for instance, a law degree 40% of what a lawyer does can now be replicated using a large language model. So not only do we have to redefine the skills that are required in a profession, we have to now do that in an agile way with the technology that's available. And so I think that something around this nexus and tipping point around the technological advancements and the need to focus on skills is moving. I think the other thing that you mentioned that I want to hit on is that the slow opportunity to build consensus or change management, the timeline it takes. I remember talking to David Lefevre, who was at Imperial College in the UK, who does AI research. And one of the things he said to me is, I can't figure out how to get the research out fast enough that is still relevant in a month later. So I think the other piece is we're going to have to start challenging these mental models that we have around what consensus buying means. How do we build collaboration? Maybe it's not so much about a task force that takes 18 months, but how do we stand up a working group and then we have, daily stand-ups for 2 weeks? Or to your point around Waterloo stance, here's where we stand today, but it has to be iterative because we just don't know where we're going to end up even a year from now. And so I think it is, we are just scratching the surface of the kinds of things that we're seeing. And so I think it's coupled with a need for students coming out of the pandemic, because I think the pandemic, as you mentioned, what it did was it brought everybody to the table to have conversations around online and hybrid learning. Those that were in the corners of the rooms that said, yep, it's not for me, it immediately threw them in this big melting pot and experimentation, the innovation work that you and I love to do. So it was good in terms of exposure, but it was bad in terms of really not giving them an opportunity to see what good teaching and learning looks like in a well-designed online course, and how emergency remote teaching is very different from a pedagogically thought out, intensive, intuitive course in terms of build. So now we're trying to move these big glaciers around with people who've had, in some instances, a negative experience during the emergency remote teaching, and trying to move them into the right direction, get them education, but also take advantage of all those who were excited after having that experience and move them in the right direction as well. And so I said a lot there, but
no,
you know how we are. We always
absolutely no, and it's perfect, and it connects very well to this notion that we were discussing in our last podcast too, around deep learning,
yes,
versus surface learning. Because I feel like during that emergency remote teaching, so many people were coming to the hybrid online world, and it was very surface level.
Yeah,
it was difficult. They hadn't had that opportunity to really understand their content area or their pedagogical ideas or expectations in that space. How do you see deep learning and this, again, I think it's another form of identity crisis, that a lot of that transmission oriented way we thought of education, the transformational way we're now viewing it, requires more deep learning skill sets. And how are you working at D2L to promote those, to make your platforms and tools easy to create learning experiences that afford deep learning, right?
Yeah.
Because we have to remember also that a lot of people using LMS technology, whether it's Brightspace or Moodle or Blackboard or whatever it is that you're using, they're not coming, a lot of them, as instructional designers. They might not even be coming with any experience designing a website or anything online before. So how are we supporting deep learning amongst these identity crises?
Yeah. So I want to go back. I want to first acknowledge and thank the work of Dr. Kim Bain. I had the fortunate pleasure of having Dr. Kim Bain, who wrote the book, What the Best College Teachers Do and What the Best College Students Do, back in around 2012, 2013. He was the provost at the institution. And one of the things that Ken and I talked about was that surface learners do as little as possible to get by. Right? Surface learning is really about memorizing those facts and dates, like cramming for that exam. And after that exam is over, if they've walked out of that exam room, like all of that information is gone. And really, that deep learning versus surface is really gaining that rich and meaningful educational experience because they want to pursue a passion. So there's less about the grades and more about a passion pursuit. And so for many of those who are in those examples, it's, how do we as faculty members create learning opportunities that don't promote surface learning? Perfect example is multiple choice, right? Think about the opportunity that we give students in a multiple choice exam. Not saying that there's not a place and space for that, but if every assessment in your course is multiple choice, we are missing the opportunity to think about deep learning. And so really thinking about how can students in math solve math problems using multiple methods, right? Not just being able to say, give me your answer and show your work, but how can they really replicate those models? And so he really opened my eyes to this because in 2009, 2010, I really got embedded in thinking about andragogical and heutagogical approaches to learning. And what I've realized as a field is we're still stuck in this whole mental model of pedagogy. We haven't even moved to andragogy. And for some of us who have, and thinking about the 6 tenets of andragogy, we can't get to heutagogy because we haven't figured out how to get that self-directed learning in place in ways that do things like create an invitational syllabus. Can you invite students into the learning experience because we are co-constructing knowledge together? And so one of the things that I love about the work that we're doing in Brightspace at D2L is creating opportunities and spaces to co-construct, to provide faculty members the experiences so you don't have to be an instructional designer. So one of the products that we just released in the last 6 months is Creator Plus. One of the barriers that we find often is for faculty members, as you mentioned, who aren't coders or instructional designers. They don't know how to create and code all the different widgets. But if we have created a self-service model where they can drag and drop, ease of use to create and curate content in a very easily accessible way, like that is where we can give faculty the opportunity to focus on their passion and creating those deep learning experiences and less on the tools and the bells and the whistles. And I'll say a step further, not knowing when this is going to air, the next part of us looking at Creator Plus is to then utilize AI enhancement. So now taking, Michelle, your content that you've built in your course in Creator Plus, I will be able to go in and use AI to create practice questions based on your specific content, right? Mm-hmm. So thinking about mitigating the risk, as we talked about earlier, but still moving forward. I think the last thing I will say after working with Ken is I really got involved in Think's work. So really thinking about Bloom's taxonomy. We've known about Bloom's for decades, right? What I love about Think's work is he moved us to a new mental model on significant learning. And so in his model, he says there are 6 concepts that are interrelated, unlike Bloom's that we stack, right? Like we have to have understanding before we move up to evaluating. Like it's a natural transition. Think's work says that this is not a linear process, that interleaving between these 6 components is necessary to build on one another. And I'll just name them 6 really quickly, and then I'll jump off my soapbox. The first one is foundational knowledge. Thinking about the facts or the contents of a course, like what are the terms and the facts that you need for the course, right? Okay, got it. Next, moving to the human dimension, understanding self and others, thinking about collaboration, perspective taking, really moving into that area. Then he moves into application. So how do you take that foundational knowledge and how do you connect it in different decisions that you need to make? How do you problem solve, right? When we talk about creating those opportunities. And then caring. So thinking about the affect evolution of learning, we sometimes get so structured in these other domains, we forget that we are human beings at the core. And so that learning is a social aspect. And then the last 2 are integration. So how do we think about the synergies among the subjects? So when I'm thinking about problem solving or collaboration, it doesn't just happen in my writing course. It doesn't just happen in my math course, but there are opportunities to think about integration. And the last one is my favorite, is learning how to learn. So that's all metacognition. And I think that what you are asking me about faculty members and administrators is we live in a knowledge-rich economy now. Knowledge is cheap. At any point, any of us can go and get knowledge. What our responsibility as students is now to teach learners how to learn. And if we can teach them how to learn, that is a skill set that will take them far and wide, no matter where this evolution of AI and those kinds of technologies. Okay, my soapbox is going back away.
That's just part one of this exciting conversation, my friends. Click on part two and continue with us on this important journey we like to call the education revolution.